Hi there, it's me. Let me stop. Deb, do you have to give me? There we go. That's what I needed. Thank you. Okay, now I will disappear again, and we'll get back to the show at hand. How's that, Deb?
Perfect. Yep. Go ahead.
That's good. Thank you. I will turn off my picture because that's not what I want to show you. I want to show you this. This is Saskatchewan Conservation House. It was built in 1977, funded by the Saskatchewan government during the OPEC oil embargo, when we were worried about how we were going to heat our homes during cold winter months. Government of Saskatchewan funded the research and development of this house, led by a chap by the name of Dr. Orr, with a group of co-workers. And it has been acknowledged by the Passive House Institute in Europe as being an ancestor of modern Passive House standards. So when we talk Passive House Canada, we're really talking about bringing an idea back to our country. It is not a foreign concept. Moving ahead, what I want to talk about is a few of the advantages of a Passive House, and I'll be quick. You build better, feel better. That's our slogan. But you build better by using super insulated building envelope. That's the walls. High quality windows with solar orientation so that in the winter you heat your house with sunshine, and in the summer you shade your house with trees and other extensions. A ventilation system and heat recovery system second to none. So the air that you breathe, that your family breathes inside of these buildings is clean. Thermal bridge free. These structures are airtight. You feel better when you live, work, or play in a Passive House through year-round stable indoor air quality and temperature. These are very quiet and comfortable buildings. The substantial reduction in energy use and operating costs is very positive. A Passive House, a built Passive House from scratch can save you as much as 90% off of a compatible code-built home. If you are renovating a home to EnerPhit, Passive House EnerPhit standards, you can look at upwards of 70% savings of energy. One of the best parts about Passive House is that they are simple to use and they have very durable systems. When you add this all together, what you get is priceless peace of mind. Now, with our presentation today, we're attaching the slide deck. So I've got a picture that I have blatantly borrowed from Evelyne's website, and it lays out very clearly for us the comparison between a conventional construction of a house, that's the one on the left, and a Passive House constructed building on the right. Without going into all of the writing below, the picture says it all. If you look at the simplicity of the picture to the right versus the picture on the left, which frankly looks like a lot of chaos happening there, you can understand the founding principle of Passive House, that it is a very simple system based on building really good walls and ceiling. So this will be in the slide deck, or I will numerous times today encourage you to visit Evelyne's website to read her blog. You'll get some really great information there. Moving along, about Passive House Canada, we have a very simple mission. It's to make the international Passive House standard of building performance understood, achievable, and adopted by government, industry, professionals, building suppliers, and the public from right across Canada. And you can help with this if you're interested in what you're hearing. Go to our website, become a member. If you want to learn more, please spend some time to explore our education and information on Passive House performance standards. We've got lots of information for professionals, tradespeople, government, and the public. So it's now on to our guest, and this is where I would like to introduce you to Evelyne Bourchard. Before I invite or turn my camera on, welcome, Evelyne. I will turn my camera on now. There we are. Nice to see you from, where are you calling us from today?
I'm in Hemmingford, a teeny tiny village nestled in the corner of Quebec, New York State, and Vermont, so about an hour south of Montreal.
Very nice. So thank you very much for being our guest today. And as I said, I'm really excited to hear about a bit about your journey and to learn more, because you've got a very strong sense of environmentalism. So we want to hear some more about that. I've left the screen active, so we have 3 pictures up of at least 3 projects that are on your website, and we'll get to some of those in a minute. But I want to start by just asking you to tell us a little bit about yourself. You've explained where you are living in Quebec, and it is a beautiful part of the countryside. So tell us a bit about yourself. Tell us why architecture. What pulled you to to work in architecture, and a little bit about your education. We'll start there.
Sure. Why architecture? That is a good question. I think in a way it almost seemed a little inevitable. That kind of left brain, right brain thing really resonated with me. I've been good at science and math in school, but also really enjoyed creativity. And I think that's what all architects say when you ask them that question. Not a very original response. But the funny thing is that I'm in Hemmingford now, which is where I grew up. And until I was in architecture school, I'd never actually met an architect. So it seemed like a cool idea, and luckily it worked out and proved to be a great career choice because I enjoyed a lot. But it was quite a transition to go from a rural environment to the city. So I did my studies at McGill University, both my undergraduate and master's in architecture degrees there, with a student exchange in the French Alps and a year spent working in London between the two. Pre-recession, when you could just, have $2,000 in your savings account and fly to another continent and hope you can find a job and have that actually kind of pan out. Yeah, so that's kind of my background. I was in numerous cities for about 15 years and then came back to the teeny tiny town where I grew up, and that's
Very nice,
where I started Tandem.
And it is a beautiful town, and we have some pictures later on when we get talking about resiliency in terms of what drove you to that conclusion. And I certainly know that in the past 6 months, I've spent a lot of time working with architects. We are primarily an association that represents architects and engineers. And one thing I will say about the architects I've met, they're very passionate about the environment. They're very passionate about passive house buildings. But they really are the philosophers of the building industry. Will say that they take a very 360-degree view of the world in which we all inhabit. So it's been quite entertaining and quite educational for me to rub shoulders with the likes of you and others. So thank you very much for that. So tell us a little bit about your firm.
Yeah, so I founded Tandem 3 years ago. I just moved across the country from Vancouver, which was where I first drank the Passive House Kool-Aid. And so I moved back home. I was coming out of mat leave with my first child, and had decided that since I really wanted to be here, and since there were no architects here, I'd see if I could make those two things work. And it was, it felt like a bit of a shot in the dark, but I really wanted to create a firm that reflected my own values first. I'd been fortunate to be at local practice in Vancouver before, which was also a very values-driven firm. So a lot of like-minded people, having those philosophical discussions over lunch about not just what we're doing, but why and how we could improve it. And trying to carry that spirit on and kind of take my own angle on it.
Mm-hmm.
And I'd love to, I guess I have an interest in rural projects as well, which is often overlooked in architecture. Architects often don't think that there's anything beyond the inner city, or maybe the suburbs. We talk about the suburbs a bunch, but there's very little beyond that. And so I figured there might not be a lot of work, but there might be enough for one. So that was my goal there.
You're that one, whereas, as you said, many architectural firms are focusing on the big silver baubles that are in downtown urban settings. So it's a unique setting that you find yourself in. So you mentioned values. What are the values of the firm? What's your underpinning philosophy?
I think fundamentally it's to not use more than you need. Leave leave some for others, leave some for nature, and to be really thoughtful. I was, recently in a discussion I'm also on the Sustainable Built Environment Committee of the OAA, the Ontario Association of Architects, and there was a great discussion in our meeting yesterday where someone said, ugliness isn't sustainable. And I thought that was really terrific because it kind of brings it all together. The idea is to make really beautiful, poetic spaces that you want to be in, and that also tread lightly in terms of the resource use and the energy it takes to run them and to make them comfortable. So that kind of synthesis of beauty and performance and just creating shelter and home, there's such kind of fundamental human needs. And I think that there's a lot of room for us to improve in that regards.
And again, it's dangerous for someone who's new to this space and certainly not an architect to talk about what I'm seeing. So the slide I have up with 3 of the projects that you've led sort of speaks to, and I don't know if the word is a minimalist approach, but certainly there's not a lot. They're very clean looking projects to me, which I'm always attracted to, quite frankly. Do you want to, can you spend a minute and just tell us a little bit about each of these 3 projects that we have up on the screen? They are beautiful.
Sure. So the one up at the top is now lived in, very recently completed. I haven't been able to go since it's been moved into because of the pandemic, which is very strange. Right. It's like sending your kids off to college when you finish a project. And it's weird to be distant, but anyways, it's a single family home that's pursuing the Passive House Institute's low energy building standard in Perth, Ontario. And it was the first project that I did start to finish as Tandem. So my first house project, because I'd always been in larger buildings prior to founding Tandem. And so it was just a really special project. On top of that, it was for someone I've known since I was a little kid. Her dad built it because he just retired from a carpentry school. I'd known him since I was about 5 years old. So it's just this amazing synthesis of really cool people who are in it for all the right reasons.
Right. Wonderful. Yeah. Wonderful.
The one in the middle is affordable housing for grad students and other, the community around Simon Fraser University in Burnaby, BC. So it was the last project I worked on when I was in BC. And I've actually continued to consult on the project remotely from Quebec as well. So that one's just starting construction now. Wow. And it is unfortunately not certifying Passive House, but we have modeled it using PHPP. We even did our own pseudo design stage review. So we've done everything but the actual certification. Unfortunately, we don't always have the means to do that on all projects. And it's clocking in pretty close to the Passive House targets. So Wonderful. The idea there was really to be, kind of no frills, but to give people a dignified and decent place to live and a place where affordability is a major concern, right. And to create buildings that be durable in the long term.
Okay, good. Now the one on the bottom, you have a little note by this picture that you said that this is a teaser, and you said more details to follow. So I don't know if you can give us many more details, but wow, it really looks, once again, very clean lines, and I like that sort of simple aesthetic that it espouses. Can you tell us anything about this?
This one is our own house. So it's my little pandemic project. Okay. I'd been, we currently live in a charming, very old, very leaky farmhouse, and we know it's on its last legs. And so around Christmas time, I started working on what would come next. And I think it took about 3 years to hum and haw about whether we would do a deep retrofit or whether we'd build new. In the end, our current house just has too many fundamental problems to make the retrofit viable. So we're going to, deconstruct and salvage what materials we can. And so this model was part of my coping strategy in the early days of the pandemic, to just kind of keep doing something creative that was moving in the right direction when everything else was suddenly slowing down.
Wonderful. Well, it's a beautiful looking project. I certainly know one thing I learned very quickly was that once I visited and spent some time in a passive house, I came back to my 1964 somewhat leaky home. Even though we put new windows and lots of insulation in, it's still leaky, really leaky compared to a passive house build. And I said to my wife, this job is going to cost us a lot of money because I want a passive house really badly. They are so quiet, so comfortable, just a wonderful environment in which to live or to work. And next week, we'll have some guests on who will be talking about passive house buildings for a place that we can play in. So there's a teaser for next week. So these are absolutely wonderful. And what I wanted to do, I'm going to, well, let's keep the slides moving along a bit, because what I wanted to talk to you about next is why passive house? What attracted you to the passive house movement initially? Then we'll get on to some of the other issues we wanted to talk about. But high level, why passive house?
Sustainability has always been a kind of core interest of mine. I think it was just my upbringing. My mom had me picking litter out of ditches in a formative age, so that really stayed with me. And in terms of passive house, in a way, it was a lucky coincidence. I took a night class at UBC with Guido Wimmers in, I want to say maybe 2012.
Right.
And it was really kind of one of the first passive house trainings that was available in Vancouver at the time. I happened to be in the same class as Scott Kennedy and Killian Collins and some of the other now passive house pioneers. So it was in a way just a kind of right place, right time. But it really struck me because to me as an architect, I found it very empowering. Most of what passive house is about is good design and good details. And I felt that it kind of rounded out and filled in gaps in my education. My formal education in university just hadn't taught me how to do that level of detailing. And I hadn't learned it in the firms I'd interned at either. And that kind of the rigor and building science background was something I felt that I had been lacking. And it's really empowering. I feel like, you know, there's a lot of good work that's been done in sustainability and architecture, but passive house is really about the building envelope, which is something that fundamentally we as architects are responsible for. So it's not so much learning a new system as just improving our kind of basic practices. Once you start thinking about buildings this way, you can't go back to drawing poor performing buildings, because you see those thermal bridges and those air leaks everywhere. Even if you put less insulation, you'll know how to do the airtightness detailing better. So it raises the bar on all of your work.
Right. So, and this is what I hear. I watch folks who come and take some of our courses, and I should mention that you're a fantastic instructor for Passive House Canada. So not only do you live it and sit on our board, but you help us spread the word through being an instructor on some of our key courses, and thank you for doing that. That's some of the best advocacy work we can do, is to reach out and educate other professionals as you're doing, and have them, as they say, drink the Kool-Aid and carry on with the messaging. But what I'm told by yourself and others is that by the beginning of day 2 of training, everyone is now bought into passive house, and they are all saying they can never go back, especially when they understand it's really about good design and good building oversight. But really, it starts with good design, which is something they have control over. So why would you build a second-rate building when you know how to build to passive house standards? That's generally what's coming out of it, and people adjust and carry on. So it's a great challenge. But what struck me when I was reading your blog the other day, what struck me is one of your blog posts was talking about resiliency, and this is a topic that's near and dear to my heart. Just for a second, in my wearing a previous hat as Minister of Environment and Climate Change, the focus was always around mitigation, but there came a point when I said to our government, we also have to start focusing on adaptation, because climate change is actually, it's not coming, it's here. The effects of climate change will progressively grow worse and have greater impact on us in our province of Ontario, as we will all face increased impacts across the country. How do we adapt? And that's that road we were starting to head down before I was forcibly retired by the public. There's a whole other story there. But I'm so delighted to see you picking that up and you running with that whole concept of mitigation isn't good enough. We also have to talk about adaptation. So that leads me to your thoughts around resilience. how did you come to this conclusion? And can you talk to us for a minute or so about resilience? And I'm going to just click the slide here because I understand from your blog that this is really what got you thinking about it. And here we have Hemmingford, 1998.
Yeah.
Was it? Yeah. So tell us what's happening here and the effect it had on you.
Yeah, so this was the 1998 ice storm that iced over much of southern Quebec and Ontario, eastern Ontario. Essentially everything got coated in about 3-4 inches of ice. We were out of power because we were a rural location. We were out of power for 29 days.
Right.
We were low on the list of priorities. I think we were kind of the last place around to get reconnected, and it really highlighted two things for me. It highlighted our fragility in terms of our reliance on the electrical grid, and at the time phones, because it's 1998, so nobody had cell phones, so we had no communication, no power, and it was January. And most of us had no running water either because we're all on wells. We don't, and people in the village had municipal water, but we were out in the country, so our water pump wasn't working either. But it also was an amazing moment of community, and just seeing people coming together. And it was, at the time I was a teenager, I was in high school, and when I think back, most of the memories I have of that time are actually quite positive, which is a nice reminder as I'm raising a child through a global pandemic right now. What I remember is that, people would host dinner parties because everyone had a lot of food in the freezer and it was all going to go bad. So you eat the best things first and you have everybody over.
Right.
So a lot of candlelit dinners and playing the board games we gotten for Christmas until we, would never be able to play them again because we just cycled through them so many times. But this kind of checking in on neighbors and, making sure there was enough for everyone and spreading out the resources that we did have to make sure that everyone was taken care of, was really, a really memorable moment. I think a moment that shaped me.
Yeah, so in a nutshell, can you, for your professional practice, can you define for us what a resilient building is?
I think a resilient building is a building that doesn't rely on too many inputs, that can kind of just keep ticking along. And I'm not necessarily talking about a building that's fully off grid. I think, if you have access to an electrical grid, that's a great thing. And that helps pay for the grid for everybody. And it's kind of like a giant battery, even if you were generating, you can feed that back into the grid. So I'm not saying that you necessarily completely self-sustaining out in the bush somewhere. But I do think that the less we rely on external systems, external inputs, the more resilient we are, because if one of those systems shuts down, then you weren't taking that much from it to begin with.
Right.
So it's easier to replace it with something else, essentially.
Okay, that's good. So where does Passive House fit into this?
So for me, the light bulb moment to make the connection between Passive House and resiliency, and this is a little embarrassing because I feel like I should have thought of it long before, but it was when Lisa King from the City of Toronto came to give a guest lecture in a 128 course that I was teaching in Toronto, and talked about why the City of Toronto was interested in Passive House. And the first thing she brought up wasn't because, we want to reduce GHG emissions, and obviously that's part of it. But the first thing she brought up was that, we know more storms are coming, more extreme weather is coming. And as a city, if the power goes out and no one can stay at home, everyone has to be evacuated. That's a major crisis. The emergency services would be overloaded. When we think about flattening the curve in the context of COVID, that would be another kind of spike in emergency services all being solicited at the same time. And so their interest in Passive House was that, when they've looked at all building standards around the world, and they just said, well, what happens if we have an extended power outage? So they modeled a 72-hour power outage and a 2-week power outage in the middle of winter, and looked at the internal temperatures in residential buildings where people could potentially shelter in place. And depending on the building type, so larger buildings obviously would stay warmer, the more people in them, less surface area. But a high-rise residential building built to the Passive House standard after 2 weeks of no power, so no functioning heating system in the middle of winter in Toronto, had a modeled interior temperature of 18 degrees.
Right.
At that point, you get a woolly sweater and you're fine. So that, That's a big light bulb moment, right? That starts to impact not just being comfortable and having cheap utility bills. It means that if there is a crisis, you can stay home instead of finding yourself in a school gymnasium somewhere that has a generator.
And I know living north of Toronto, it's not, unfortunately, it's not uncommon to see large high rises, condominium apartments run into trouble with their electrical supply. Over the past couple of years, I can think of 3 or 4 major incidents where massive transformer fires that feed the building have been knocked out. And it takes weeks sometimes, certainly days, to get them back online. And in the meantime, the city is, has to step in and take care of people and find them accommodation, especially with social housing in social housing areas or areas where people, are living at or even below the poverty level. They can't just pack up and head off to a nice hotel for a couple of weeks. But if they were living in a passive house, then they would be able to spend more time before it got to that. They'd have days instead of hours, maybe even weeks instead of a few days to carry on. So that's really important. So what I want to do is I want to just move to the next slide, because I borrowed a graphic from the City of Toronto, and I just want you to talk about it for a second. Here we have, this is from the City of Toronto, and this is explaining what, Evelyne?
This is kind of the 3 facets of the zero emissions building framework. So for those of you who are in the construction industry, if you haven't looked at this document yet, you absolutely should. I think the City of Toronto did us a great public service in not only coming up with this framework, but making it publicly available. So if you look up Toronto Zero Emissions Building Framework, they've shared information about energy efficiency, information about resiliency, about cost increases to go to increasing levels of performance, and it's all out there for us to look at and learn from. So I'd encourage you all to check it out. And this graphic is pulled from the beginning of that report. It really highlights their kind of overlapping goals. So in terms of climate mitigation, so reducing the climate change, we're looking at lowering greenhouse gas emissions and improving efficiency. So that means reducing how much energy we're consuming and making sure it comes from cleaner sources. And then, we're recognizing that that's not happening fast enough. So we are going to have to do some adaptation, and that's where improved building resilience comes in. Luckily for us, there's a lot of overlap already just in terms of the physics of those things. So if you're consuming less energy, you are kind of inherently more resilient, and it's going to help you, weather a severe storm or something like that.
Now, at the risk of having Toronto cry copyright infringement, but since I the pin on this PowerPoint presentation, here's what I've added in, which tells me the sweet spot right in the center is where we start to hit passive house performance. And I hope I'm somewhat accurate in that. I should have run this by an expert first before I did this. I get it. But I figured
passive house will help with all 3 of those essentially. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. It is that sweet spot in the center, which is why the City of Toronto, just like the City of Vancouver, Victoria, and other large cities across, well, large and small municipalities across the country are talking to us about how they bring passive house standards and in some cases even EnerPhit standards, our renovation standards, to their jurisdictions to help with these three things. We'll take that out for now because it may be an eyesore. So carrying on, let's just, what I wanted to do is to talk a little bit about, you're one of our instructors, and you teach, you mentioned 120A, 120B you were teaching in Toronto. Those are passive house courses. We have a series of courses for folks who haven't heard the pitch yet, called Pathways to Certification, because we really want to get as many people certified as passive house professionals as possible, so that as demand increases, as the City of Toronto moves towards its green housing, green building standards, we're going to need architects, engineers, tradespeople, the general public, all knowing more and more about passive house performance standards. And we're certainly going to need the professionals who can help us get there. And so our Pathways to Certification program is very important, and it's technically 120A, 120B, 120C, and Evelyne teaches 2 of those. So tell me about your experience in the classroom. Tell me a little bit about 120A, a little bit about 120B.
Sure. So the whole series is designed to help people not prepare to take on a project and prepare to pass the exam. Because after you pass the exam, you get your designation, and it's just kind of a good starting point to get into the world of Passive House. So 120A is when we delivered it in person, a 4-day theory class. It just covers all the basics of Passive House. Now we've moved it onto the web, so at the moment we're offering it as 8 half days. And 120B is focusing specifically on energy modeling. So PHPP, the Passive House Planning Package, is the energy modeling tool that goes with Passive House certification. And the beauty of it is that it's far more affordable and accessible than most energy modeling software, because it's basically just a really, really clever Excel spreadsheet with a lot of building science work built into it. But it means it's $250 instead of thousands of dollars like some of our CAD software costs. And that is really, really powerful when you're talking to a client and you can actually get into the numbers and explain why your design is not only beautiful, but also optimized. And if you get pushback on certain design decisions, you can explain exactly how you got to that solution and what the impact of changes would be with numbers. You can quantify that.
Yeah.
So those are the kind of 2 fundamental building blocks, and then 120C is pure exam prep. So we run through practice questions and try to tee everybody up to have a good run at the exam.
Have a good run at the exam. So what would you advise people who are watching today who are saying, well, I'm not an architect or an engineer, I'm not a tradesperson, I'm not interested in becoming certified, but I want to learn more. What should they do?
I have had homeowners stick it out through 120A and B. It takes a certain kind of person, not for everybody, but I'm always really impressed when they do. For people who don't necessarily want to get 26 Excel spreadsheets into this, we do have the 110 course as well, or we have the intro webinar, which is still has a good amount of content to it to really give you a well-rounded introduction. And then I'd say find a Passive House certified professional because they've done all that legwork. And it's really, the success of a project really hinges on having a team that gets it and that kind of understands the key philosophy behind it and what needs to happen from a technical standpoint. So having a good builder, having a good architect, having good engineers, and having a client who also gets it, who will kind of go, everyone has to be moving in the same direction for a project to succeed.
And I know when I talked to, you mentioned Scott Kennedy, an architect from BC. He was my first guest, and I asked him that question. What's the most important thing when it comes to building a passive house building? And in your mind, what's the most important thing you need to do?
I think it does boil down to that collaborative approach. So in a more traditional project, the architect and the builder are kept separate until a project goes out for tender and gets bid on. And then we have this not confrontational role, but there's a distance, and as there should be, right? Our code of ethics is such that we're supposed to be, the kind of mediator between the client and the builder, and that's important. But it doesn't mean we can't be sitting at the same table and doing some problem solving long before, we're ready to start a construction site. So getting buy-in from the builder and building a strong team who gets it is really, really important. And I would say starting early, baking Passive House principles into the very first notions and ideas that you have. One of my other blog posts talk about building form, and that was another kind of aha moment for me as an architect, and one that people sometimes aren't aware of. So the first napkin sketches we make really have an impact because they will haunt you forever. If you make a really complicated building form, life's going to be hard. Whereas if you kind of understood Passive House and basic building science and physics from the get-go, if that's always back of mind, you're going to set yourself up to have a more efficient and affordable project that'll perform just as well as a more complicated and expensive version of that.
Absolutely. So keep it simple, have good design, good teamwork, good builders, and a client who understands the fundamentals of Passive House and what you're trying to achieve. And all of that information folks can find on our website, he says, making a pitch. So I'm going to stop at the formal part of our conversation right now, because I'm sure Deb has taken some questions. I want to go back to this beautiful slide and say, Deb, what questions do we have?
Yeah, so I've got a question here for Evelyne. Carbon neutral, is that an aspect you consider?
Yeah, that's a great question. So it's definitely an aspect I consider in my own practice. At the moment, the Passive House standard doesn't consider embodied carbon. So that's the carbon that comes from the extraction and manufacturing of the materials that go into a building. It is, however, something that's very near and dear to the hearts of many Passive House practitioners, even if it's not officially part of the standard. I would count myself in there as well. So since we're using more insulation, for example, it's really important to be mindful of what kind of insulation that is. Where is it coming from? What is the carbon kind of burden that we're placing on the planet to create that insulation and deliver it to site? Luckily, there are lots of great options out there. So I'm a big fan of cellulose insulation, which is made of recycled newspaper, light wood frame construction, and looking at where your wood is sourced from to make sure it's from FSC certified and responsibly managed forests.
Right.
And just, yeah, generally looking for renewable materials as much as possible, using concrete sparingly because it has a big carbon footprint. So I'd say it's not part of the Passive House standard per se, but it's something to think about. And there are a lot of us in this space who are very mindful of that.
Yeah, and if I can butt in for a second, I will say the board has asked me and all of us to really start considering how we can work to advance knowledge around embodied carbon with our own members. So we are members of the Embodied Carbon Network, for example, and we're talking to organizations across North America, certainly in Canada, to see how we can start incorporating that knowledge into Canadian Passive House considerations. So more on that later. Great. Next question, Deb.
Yeah, okay, so this goes back to the conversation about 15 minutes ago, just some clarification that someone's asking for. Can you design all you want and then the client has to pay to get it checked to see if it's a certified Passive House?
No. I guess it depends. I guess I read that as, can you kind of apply Passive House to a design that's like in construction documents? And I'd say no, it really needs to be baked into the details. In terms of the actual, so yeah, to kind of design to Passive House, you need to be thinking that way from the get-go, from schematic design and doing energy modeling really all the way through so you can optimize, which is why I'd advocate all architects to at least learn basic energy modeling, and PHPP is a great entry into that so that you can make those well-informed decisions and optimize your design. And then in terms of certification, so typically the way certification works is you've got a Passive House person embedded in the design team as you're developing the project. So that could be the architect or it could be an additional consultant. And then for your building to certify, it actually needs to be reviewed by a kind of third party who is separate to that process, who's your certifier. And they are extremely experienced. They've seen more projects than anyone really. So it's kind of an additional designation above certified designer or consultant. And so they'll take your energy model and all of your project documentation and review it to ensure that you've modeled it correctly, that you've built it the way you said you would, and that they're the ones who will essentially issue the certification. So it's a quality assurance process.
Right. And
Great.
certainly one thing, sorry, Deb, to butt in, one thing I've heard from architects is that after you've completed a design, taking it to a Passive House expert and saying, can you make this or turn this into a Passive House design? In some cases it's doable, but boy, it's expensive, I bet. Good.
Okay,
Thanks.
I think we've got one more question here. What is the biggest impact on affordability?
Biggest impact on affordability is probably going to be your building form. I keep coming back to it, but it's really important because if you think that Passive House, going from code minimum to Passive House, the biggest change is going to be in your building envelope. So that's everything that contains the heated space, your walls, your floor, and your roof. And so the biggest move you can make is to reduce how much of that stuff you have. So having a relatively compact building form means that you have less of all of those pieces of envelope, which inherently makes your building more efficient because that's where your heat loss occurs, and more affordable because you're using a lot less materials to achieve the same end goal. And it can leave you money where it really matters, which is really good quality windows and a good ventilation system. Those are really the only kind of high-tech pieces of a passive house, so the windows and the ventilation. Otherwise, we're using a lot of off-the-shelf materials, just in a slightly different way.
Great. Okay.
Great.
We got another question that's just come in here too. We got a couple more minutes. What was the biggest challenge in building your project in Perth, Ontario?
Good question.
I feel like I can safely say this without jinxing myself. It actually went pretty smoothly. They're moved in now, so we're good. We need to do our final project debrief. But biggest challenge. We did import windows, which led to some timeline issues. I think on future projects, I'd look more towards domestic product, and luckily we're seeing more options gradually being available. But we had some imported windows that were very cost competitive. They worked out fine in the end. It just, threw a bit of a wrench in scheduling initially. But otherwise, it was actually, no, I've got something. Plumbers and electricians, those are your challenge. So we talked about communication and making sure everyone's on board. The trickiest part in terms of what happens during construction is the trades who were there the least. So the trades who kind of rock up, see their scope, and don't see the broader picture of what you're doing. And to be fair, that's what they always do, and that's understandable. But that's where things can go sideways in terms of airtightness really quickly. So we had a great builder who was super on the ball. He had the little air sealing gaskets. He handed them to the guys, and they didn't get installed. So there was a lot of follow up with tape. And in the end, we were able to fix it. And they spotted it quickly enough. But that coordination was the hardest part in terms of that. This is the way we've always done it attitude. It was just the people with drills who aren't there very often are the ones to watch out for.
So that they violated the number one rule: thou shalt not put a hole through the building envelope unless it's permitted and the proper gaskets are installed.
And the beauty of it is that it wasn't just our general contractor who called them out on it. It was all the other carpenters who were there all the time said, no, you can't do that, because they got it, right? They'd been meticulously taping things for weeks. And so I think that was a nice indicator of how much they really got what we were trying to do. And this is a crew who'd never done a passive house before.
And this is what I hear from builders and architects all over Canada oftentimes when they're working with a new crew, and they have them they've really bought into the passive house idea, that when it comes time to do the blower test, that's where you pressurize the house and then look for leaks. You have tradespeople who actually have a day off, or they could be on another project, are showing up because they're so invested in this project, they're so keen to see this project succeed, that they show up on their day off to look for air leaks and help with sealing them up. And it's really blown the minds of some of the contractors I've talked to who haven't seen that kind of passion in construction ever. And suddenly they're seeing the team coming together and people showing up on a day off because they want to be part of this experience. So that's what Passive House does to people. It makes them very passionate. Do we have anything else, Deb?
Nope, that looks like that's all the questions right now.
Well, listen, I'll turn the final comment over to Evelyne. Is there anything any comments you wanted to make that I've overlooked? Anything you want to add at the end?
I would just say a big thank you to Passive House Canada. It's really been a journey. So I started teaching for Passive House Canada just as I was founding Tandem, coming out of mat leave, had just moved across the country. And I've learned a lot. I've learned a lot from teaching. I've learned from the questions people have asked me. It's really been incredibly motivating to see people have those light bulb moments and to be engaged. And to just really, ask good questions and to see have them come up to me at the end of a course and say, this has really changed what I do. As a professional, I find that incredibly rewarding because I feel like my impact goes beyond the project, the relatively modest volume of projects that I can take on as an individual, and it can kind of radiate out and change other people's way of working. So I'm very grateful to have been able to and to continue to work with this great organization.
And we're certainly thankful for the work that you do. And I'll tell the viewers, anyone who's interested in learning more about Passive House at the very basic introductory level, Evelyne has done a fantastic video for us, both in English and French, that are free. If you sign up for our newsletter, no other commitment than signing up for our newsletter, you'll have access to one of Evelyne's introductions to the Passive House way of thinking, and we're so happy to be able to present that at no cost. And then there's other education that if we get you hooked with that video or this webinar, there's an introduction to Passive House, a good solid 8 hours of learning, and then maybe we'll get you from there into the 120 series. But there certainly is lots to learn. Whether you're a member of the public, a government official, architect, engineer, anyone involved in the building industry, there's something on the website for you if you want to go and explore. So thank you again, Evelyne, for spending some time with us today. We'll be putting this broadcast on our Passive House Canada YouTube channel, so you can go back and review it. Anyone else can come in, and if they've missed the live broadcast, they'll get a chance to see it on YouTube. So I will leave it there for now. I will invite us both to turn our cameras off. I have one more slide, and then we'll let people get on with their day. Thanks again. We'll talk soon, Evelyne.
Chris.
Be safe, wash your hands, and take care of your neighbors. Thank you very much for your time, everyone. We'll see you next week.